The genre of horror games is one that has followed a path no one could have imagined. A small, underground genre with only a few games defining it originally has grown to be a defining category of the video game world, especially in the last 25 years. However, the recent explosion in popularity in horror games cannot be explained without the context of the genre as a whole. This video will be a deep dive into the beginning of horror, the defining traits of the category, and how it has grown exponentially into what it has become in 2025. As there is no way to include every single horror game released within each time period, I will only be focusing on games that have had the largest effect on the genre as a whole in each era. This is not saying that no other games affected the definition of the category, it is, however, just providing the ability to focus down on a smaller amount to better explain their influence. In order to discover the beginning roots of horror, we need to travel back to 1981, when 3D Monster Maze was first released. It was a randomized maze survival game with a T-Rex hunting after you as you tried to navigate your way through a maze. The game was made up of a total of 22 characters, featured no audio, and the only way to keep track of where the dinosaur was within the maze was through small text hints given at the bottom of the screen. Originally, the game was never meant to exist, much less have a dinosaur hunting you down within its walls. The game came to be due to the curiosity of its creator, Malcolm Evans. The idea of adding a monster to the maze was given to Evans by one of his friends, John Gray, who said, "Oh, it might be a good idea to put a monster in it. Then it might be saleable, you see." As much as this maze navigation game may not seem scary in concept, it was incredibly well received, and set the precedent of the genre moving forward. 3D Monster Maze set the requirements of horror to include survive by staying away from a threat, provide a general sense of unease, provide an achievable escape, and allow for replayability. 2 years later, in 1983, two movie franchises tried to create video games based off of their respective films. Both Halloween and Texas Chainsaw Massacre attempted this, however, both were met with less than positive reviews. Texas Chainsaw Massacre featured the first playable video game villain in Leatherface, as you try to hunt down and kill people in the woods while avoiding traps and other barriers along the way. Halloween, on the other hand, set the player as a babysitter, trying to protect and save children from within houses while avoiding the killer, Michael Myers. Many local game stores refused to carry Halloween due to believing it would fail to sell well, and most people who did take a chance on the game called it too gore-filled. If you can count 6 pixels of blood, gore. These games, while based off of horror movies popular in the 80s, didn't really qualify as horror titles. They each lacked one, if not multiple, of the requirements established by games earlier. TCM, for example, failed to have any sense of unease, or threats to avoid, as the obstacles didn't do anything other than slow the player down for a few seconds, and both games failed to have an achievable endpoint, as in Halloween, if you cleared a level, the killer would just speed up. So, while these two games introduced the concept of basing horror games on movies and shows and events, they in and of themselves failed to actually be horror games as the genre had already been defined. The early 90s introduced a very large jump in the horror landscape, as Alone in the Dark, released in 1992, was the first ever 3D horror game. The game was set within a mansion where you had to avoid monsters roaming the halls as you explored different rooms within the building. The game used fixed camera angles within each room to not only save memory, but also increase the tension of not being able to see everything around you, leaving blind spots for monsters to walk in from. This also introduced the concept of inventory management, requiring you to only keep the essentials on your character and plan ahead for what might be needed in the future. Alone in the Dark also introduced puzzle solving more into the mainstream concept of horror games, having multiple puzzles players had to complete before traveling to the next area. Alone in the Dark made so many developments in the world of horror that it allowed the next game of the 90s to really flourish, and bring the first game in the top-selling horror franchise of all time to life. Resident Evil released in 1996 to incredible reviews. It expanded upon Alone in the Dark's capabilities in both gameplay and horror. Resident Evil is a zombie survival horror game that has you once again trapped within a mansion, having to solve puzzles and explore your way to freedom. It used fixed camera angles and the concept of inventory management. However, it introduced the concept of fighting back against the creatures trying to attack you. Resident Evil featured combat sequences of shooting down zombies, while also trying to solve puzzles within each room to progress towards the exit. This was also the first horror game to introduce save points into the horror genre. There were designated rooms within the house, also known as safe rooms, where you could save the game and be sure that nothing would attack you. Resident Evil told a full story throughout the game, explaining how zombies had been created, using science instead of an unexplainable magical reason, which added a level of realism to the game that hadn't been explored in other titles. Silent Hill, released in 1999, was Konami's response to the success of Resident Evil, bringing new ideas in how to build tension within a game. It used things like fog, darkness, a fully composed soundtrack, and other ambient noises, but it also featured a more grounded approach to survival horror. The player character would breathe heavily after running for an extended period of time, and was unable to take large amounts of damage. It also used a third-person perspective instead of the usual fixed camera style of years earlier. Overall, the 90s really allowed the horror game genre to progress in establishing the concepts that would be used as defining traits of the category moving forward. It also delved deeply into the ideas of survival horror, finding ways to outmaneuver and outsmart the horrors lurking in the shadows of these games. Survival horror became the core of most of the games moving forward in time. Many of the mechanics from the 80s, like puzzle solving, avoiding something chasing the player, having an ending to the game, and, again, providing a general sense of unease, remained as important core values of the genre. But the 90s added on the ability to fight back against whatever was chasing the player, telling a story throughout the game, and using ambient effects like fog and background noises to develop the world within the game itself. The early 2000s continued the development for both the Resident Evil and Silent Hill franchises, releasing multiple sequels each within the next 10 years. However, it was largely seen as an experimental era for the horror game genre as a whole. Many horror games within this era focused heavily on the shooter aspect style that Resident Evil focused on. For example, Left 4 Dead 2. Which is the second installment in the Left 4 Dead franchise. Left 4 Dead 2 is described as, this cooperative action horror first-person shooter takes you and your friends through cities, swamps, and cemeteries of the Deep South, from Savannah to New Orleans across 5 expansive campaigns. The use of both FPS and action horror within the game's description shows how the two genres had overlapped enough that the lines between the two had become somewhat muddled. Fatal Frame, however, which released in 2001, brought a whole new perspective to the game in a literal sense. Within Fatal Frame, the way to fight back against the ghost haunting the mansion the player found themselves in was to take photos of them. The closer the ghost was to the camera, the more damage it would do, actually encouraging the player to get up close and personal with the dangers of the game. Whenever the camera mechanic was used, it forced the player into a first-person point of view, which was the first horror game to do so. It forced the player to face the terrors haunting the game face-on, with no good way to separate the player from the in-game character. Due to this, many people failed to finish the game because of just how scary they found it. To the point that the creators ended up releasing a slightly easier version of the game so that people could actually complete it. The early 2000s experimented a lot. However, the line between shooter and horror game had become very gray and muddled within the time. The idea of fighting back against creatures became the forefront of many horror games, and they often lost that stealth-heavy, careful gameplay that built tension, and leaned less into the unsettling atmosphere of previous games, instead focusing on the action sequences throughout. This drastically changed in the 2010s, however, due largely to the popularization of the video platform known as YouTube. Content creators found that playing games and posting their playthroughs and reactions online could bring in a lot of traction to their pages. Horror games and over-dramatized reactions to the scares within them were extremely popular on the platform, so they became a very common video. This brought many horror games of the 2010s a lot of traction, not only due to the marketing originally done for the game, but now because the creators posting their own content about it brought more people to see it. One of the first games featured this way was Amnesia. Amnesia focused on the fear of the unknown and feeling completely helpless within your surroundings. This allowed for great content because creators learned what was going on at the same time as their viewers, allowing for more genuine reactions. Another game that really blew up in the horror content space was Slenderman. Creepypastas have long since existed, however Slenderman was the first one to be adapted into a playable game. Due to the constant running, inability to look at the thing chasing you, hidden bits of a story to try and piece together, and a terrifying yet unexplainable creature after you, it was the perfect game for creators to play on their channels. This content-first style era of horror created one of the biggest phenomenon horror games of all time. One that would change the landscape of the genre forever, solidly dividing it into multiple subsections of horror that hadn't yet been fully developed. This game was almost entirely popularized due to creators posting their reactions and thoughts on the game on YouTube, as there was almost no other marketing done for the game. However, those videos remain to be some of the most watched horror games videos of the time. This game was Five Nights at Freddy's, an indie mascot horror game that focused heavily on the jump scare style horror. Instead of trying to run away from creatures hunting you down, Five Nights at Freddy's instead put the player stuck in one position, having to defend themselves against animatronics trying to kill them. This took inventory management and shifted it into resource management, as players had to watch the power left that they had within the building, or be left defenseless against the robots roaming the halls. Five Nights at Freddy's separated indie and mascot horror from the generalized genre of horror. This started the split of horror games into multiple subcategories, which grew to include indie, mascot, survival, psychological, stealth, narrative, and action. These subgenres, while all still having these core beliefs as the category used as a whole, found ways to differentiate themselves from one another. Indie horror, for example, involved using things like lower frame rates, less detailed graphics, and VHS-style imagery to really set themselves apart. A good example of indie horror is Fears to Fathom, a game released in 2021. This game used lower graphics settings to create a general sense of unease throughout. Any of the NPCs, non-player characters, throughout the game were developed in a way that it wasn't possible to entirely make out the details of their faces, and their bodies were more blocky and unrefined, leaving a sense of discomfort as the player explored. This, as well as the general VHS-style discoloration of the game, added to the suspense and unease a player would feel as the game progressed. These tactics of manipulating the feelings of the player are what set this subgenre apart from the others. This allowed the quickly growing number of horror games releases per year to create their own qualifications for what counted as a horror game, unlike the general consensus used previously in horror game history. Almost all maintain the same core values that horror has possessed throughout the years, though. Things such as, again, creating a sense of unease, providing something for someone the player should be afraid of as they progress, using environmental storytelling to create an immersive world, and providing the player with an ending to the game's storyline. Horror games had already grown at an alarming rate. However, once these subcategories were established, the genre exploded even more, reaching a peak of over 2,000 horror games being released on Steam categorized as horror in 2024 alone. From 3D Monster Maze, a game with only 22 characters in its entirety, there was sparked an ever-evolving genre of games that has found its way to incite terror into its players for over 30 years now. While there will always be changes happening within the gaming community, it has become clear time and time again that while this genre may shift, horror games are a staple of the space and will not be going anywhere anytime soon.